Around 2014, I saw a video that had been put up about how 8 candles could heat a house for 4 cents an hour. I had a problem with this because of just simple thermodynamics. So I thought about it for a little while and created my own video. It took some time to get some traction, but I did have some interest, and I changed the name of the video slightly, and I got over 80,000 views on that video. I decided to continue with testing and learning more about what a candle can and can't do because there was interest. Now I have some solid information that says precisely what candle heaters can do. With the results of 36 good and fairly well-controlled tests, let's see what is myth and what is reality. Here we are. This is all 36 tests. It is a lot of data. There are literally hundreds of thousands of data points. There is so much data here, it is hard to understand what we can learn. It is not, however, too much. There are 4 things we can learn from this big picture. First, these tea lights run for about 3 hours. The original tea lights I started with ran for 4 hours, but manufacturing change a couple of years ago dropped them to 3 hours. So, oh well. Second, we can see that there are 3 sections of operations. We have heating, operating temperature, and cooling. Third, the temperature doesn't really change that much across most of the sensors that I used. And I had 10 sensors around the pot and 2 sensors in other places in the room to see if it affected anything. Finally, only 1 sensor had a large temperature change, and even then it was not consistent across all of the tests. That was my 10th sensor, and it was in direct contact with the top of the pot, which was both a blessing and a curse. I'll get into that in a second. Now that we have the big picture, what more can we learn? What is the next question to answer? The biggest statement that I have seen after the idea of heating a house is the idea that more mass, both in metal and pots, is better. This is why I ran these tests. I wanted to know how true that statement is. And because of that, I am focusing on 2 variables. Everything else I don't really care about, and there's enough of them that, it would make an engineer cry to try to touch even a remote part of them. But the 2 that I'm interested in are heat and time. How long does it take to get to temperature, and how hot does it get? As well as how long it takes to cool down, and if that really matters. With these 36 test runs, I have learned a great deal about what a candle can do and what one of these pots can do. The 9 layouts that I tested were a pot by itself, both raised and lowered, a pot with a lid on it, which I couldn't lower because that would put out the candles, and then I put coins underneath the lid so that it could vent, and I was able to do that with a raised and lowered test. And that was my first 5 tests, because I wanted to know what the pot would do by itself and what the different way of having the lid or the coins in it did, so that I could have a baseline, and I could compare that baseline to all of the other tests. And so I had just the pot, and then I put a lid on it, and then I put the coins under the lid, and I tested it in a total of 5 different layouts. Then I put a single bolt in the pot, just the bolt and a washer and a nut on either side of the top to hold it in place. And then I filled up that bolt with all the washers and nuts that I could. And then I put in 2 pots and filled it up all the way with washers and nuts. And then I did 3 pots. And now I can compare a single pot, a pot with a lid, or a pot with a lid and coins to 3 other different layouts. 4. So those are my 9 tests. And now let's look at what this gives us. Now it is time that we move into the data. I'm not a statistician, but what I do understand about statistics is that they are used to show trends. By showing the trends, we can see how things flow. With that in mind, I'm hoping to show the most relevant of the data points to give the widest range of good information. Each of the 9 different layouts had different results, obviously, and many were very similar. So let's look at what I was surprised by in some of the results. All of my data points also had different readings simply because they were at different locations. I want to start at the hottest point so we can see what the highest temperature obtained is, and then we can compare that to the amount of drop that there is as it spreads out. The hottest point is data point 10, which is in direct contact with the top of the pot. For data point 10, with the pot by itself, I got very high output. I was expecting this, but it also shows some of the problem with data point 10. It's a blessing to have the highest temperature, but I'm not sure it shows all of the true output. In this, it's also a bit of a curse. The open hole on the top of the pot and the Stirling engine, which I used to hold the sensor down, directed the heat to hit the sensor. Is this the most accurate temperature for the top of the pot? That's my one problem with this, and I would like to figure out some way to get that absolutely correct and verifiable, but I don't have that right now. However, I did plan ahead a little bit, and so I had data point 2 touching the pot as well, but it was at the very bottom of it. As you can see, the pot warmed up quite differently at data point 2 than at data point 10. It would be wonderful if I had a sensor that could show me the temperatures all the way down every half inch or so I can see how much the heat changed going down the pot. Not sure I can do this with a direct contact. Maybe I could find an infrared camera. I don't know. But starting with the single pot by itself without a lid, most of the heat went out the top. Data point 10 shows this, with data point 2 being much lower. This is understandable, and it isn't a big deal, but that means that the pot itself can't radiate as much heat because the entire pot doesn't get as hot. By putting a lid on it in the second test and beyond, I'm able to get up to 12 degrees more heat Fahrenheit at the bottom of the pot, around 6, maybe a bit more Celsius. This isn't mind-blowing heat, but it is warmer. Therefore, the entire pot gets hotter and can radiate more heat further, which is something you want to do. Another interesting reading was that the lowered pots actually don't get as hot as the raised pots. I'm thinking this is because the heat from them was traveling out, either didn't stay long enough to begin with, or the chimney effect caused faster movement, which effectively cooled the pot and the lid because it was just moving so much air. That is an interesting fact to see and worth remembering, that lowering a pot doesn't actually output more heat. With the bolt in the pot, I again question the heat at data point 10 just a little bit because the bolt itself got hot and radiated heat. Was that altering the temperature at all? I don't know. But with data point 2, I'm getting more heat than I did with a lid. How did the base of the pot get more heat? I was expecting the pot with the lid to have the greatest amount of heat and the bolt to not really make a difference, but it seems that it may have. Maybe the direction of the lid matters as well. I left it with the edges up. Maybe if I flip it over, the lid can hold more heat in. Not sure. The other problem with the bolt is the galvanization. The zinc on the bolt burns and becomes a toxic gas. Yeah, that's a problem. In a large enough space, it dissipates, and with very little burning going on, it's not a big deal. But for one person heating a small space, that becomes a toxic problem. With the two pots, I wasn't expecting the outer pot to have as much heat, but it still had more heat output than the two lowered pots, and at the base for data point 2. How much of a difference was there from the top to the bottom? I'd really love an infrared camera. As you can see, the top of the pot had some pretty substantial temperatures, with the highest being 325 degrees Fahrenheit or 163 degrees Celsius. That's nothing to laugh at, well above boiling point of water. And I've actually seen a person fry eggs with 3 or 4 candles. It took a while, but they were able to do it. So, this is putting out a substantial amount of heat. However, most of the readings were at or below 200 degrees Fahrenheit, 93 Celsius. I was expecting the runs with the 2 pots and the 3 pot, the multi-pots, to be lower, simply because there was more mass to heat up. But they weren't the lowest. I was pleasantly surprised that the lowest temperature at the base was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius. For all of these tests, there's just not that much heat to begin with. But with added mass, they still get to a good temperature. Now that we've seen the temperature of the pots, let's see how much heat radiated how far. Right beside the top of the pot, at just 3 to 5 inches away, was data point 5. Basically an inch above the pot, to the left about 3 to 5 inches, or 2.5 centimeters up, and I'm doing math in my head, about 8 centimeters to 11 centimeters to the left was data point 5. As you can see, it didn't really go up from room temperature much at all. The crazy result is the 3 pots with 86 degrees 30.5 Celsius. This was the highest reading of all the tests. I want to go back and look at those graphs to see if that was a steady rise or if it was a spike, because this doesn't make sense to me. The pot itself was the coolest overall, with it barely going over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 43 Celsius, yet it heated the most space. I really want to see how the pot warmed up across all of the times and data points. How did 3 pots actually radiate more heat when they were cooler than a single pot? I just don't really understand. The other data point I want to look at is data point 8, which is another foot up vertically, about, 30 centimeters, and directly above data point 5. It might be 12 to 14 inches up, 30 to 35 centimeters, something like that. But it's directly above data point 5. This reading didn't really change from room temperature, but again, the test with the 3 pots gets much warmer. It's over 10 degrees warmer than any of the single pot runs on data point 5, and almost 18 degrees warmer than any other test at data point 8. How? The only thing that I can think of at this point is that the surface area of the pot, simply because it was larger, was radiating more heat. I'm going to have to run another test and do just a single pot with the larger pot, because the pot that I used for the single tests was about 5 inches, something like that. I'll have to measure them. And the big pot was about 8 or 10 inches. And since I didn't use the big pot on all the tests, I used the smaller pot. I need to run all these tests with the larger pot. But I really had no idea that this was going to happen until I started putting these numbers together in these column graphs to share. And it just was shocking, because I didn't have a good way to compare until then. So now that we've looked at the temperatures and the heat output, I want to look at the times. I took all of my tests, the time that they ran, and I took averages. I want to see trends. In order to see the 3 different parts, the heating, the operating temperature, and the cool down, I separated all the runs into 3 sections. I took the median temperature and asked how long it took to get to that temperature, and then how long at or above that temperature, and then how long it took to get back to basically room temperature. Once it got within a couple degrees, it was like, this isn't cooling off anymore. The time to median temperature, the time above medium temperature, and the time back to basically room temperature. I also really wanted to compare data point 2 with data point 10 for their times. I'm not worried too much about the radiated heat for this output, because I just want to know how long it takes to get to temperature and get down, and the overall trend of these times. But I'm still considering the temperature of the pot itself, and each test had a slightly different temperature, but I'm not a statistician. I'm not sure how to compare that correctly. Over the 9 different test sets, the difference between the top of the pot and the bottom of the pot reaching their median temperature was sometimes very different, and honestly mostly fairly similar. All of the tests had some interesting differences. Looking first at data point 10, the overall speed of warm-up had some very large differences. This is understandable when we look at the way the heat was allowed to travel. With no lid, the time to temperature is slower and the temperature is lower. With the top covered, the times are far less and the heat is higher. Then with adding more mass, it takes longer to get the temperature, mostly. I was very surprised that the bolt didn't carry more heat through to the top. Even with the lower temperatures, the time to median was about the same, except for the last one. With 3 pots, the time to temperature was really quite fast. I'm guessing that the temperature was so low that the time to temperature was that much faster. I also wonder if the bolt itself with the small pot inside made a difference, but the 2-pot didn't do that, so I'm unsure. The time to median is something else I would like to know if I'm approaching correctly. Please let me know or look at my data and help me out with these numbers. Next, I want to look at data point 2. The time to median is rather different, but again, somewhat similar. While all the times are longer, it is good to note that when the pots are lowered, so much heat leaves so quickly due to the chimney effect that the bottom of the pot simply doesn't get as warm much less quickly. If you want to radiate heat, lowering is not the way to get more. The time to temperature increases with more mass, with the 2 pots taking the longest. Then the 3 pots took less time than anything else, but again, this might just be because of a lower temperature. I'm not really sure what happened with this. Now let's look at the time at temperature. This was ruled by the length of the time that the candles ran, which was about 3 hours, but was shorter or longer due to how long it took to get to temperature. For data point 10, the time at temperature was mostly the same except for the 2 pots and 3 pots. It looks like the 2 of them ran at operating temperature for more than an hour longer than any of the other tests. This is a bit deceiving though because the output temperature was lower overall, at least on data point 10. For data point 2, the time to temperature was really about the same, but the time at temperature was higher for the multi-pots as well. I wonder if I'm missing something with this data, or the mass comes into effect there and it just simply takes that much longer to cool down. I'm really not sure. When we look at the cooling times, the overall trend seems almost exactly the same as the run time. Data point 10 cooled off fairly quickly with the multi-pots taking the longest. This is easily understood as they have the most mass. And for data point 2, the cool down times are a little faster, but mostly look to follow the same trend. The bottom of the pots never really got very warm in comparison to the top. I wonder what it would look like if I could get a reading inside the pots. Is the 3rd pot warming at the same rate as the other pots, or is there a big difference between the single pots and the multi-pots? I would love to have some high temperature probes that could go inside the pots. My cat is playing fetch. To conclude, this series of tests prove that there are actually some differences between layouts. They aren't really huge differences, and overall there weren't many surprises. And again, you're not getting a lot of heat out of just 4 candles. But there are some important ones, with the big surprise of the 3 pots radiating as much heat as they did, even though they ran cooler. I need to understand this. So now the question of larger versus smaller pots needs to be answered. It is over a dozen degrees higher than any of the other tests. This is mind-blowing. How did that end up happening when it was running cooler? I will have to set up a new test with just the larger pot by itself to find out what is normal with 1 pot that is larger. Size matters? I don't know. The 3-pot layout uses a pot, again, about 8 or 10 inches. I'm going to have to measure that. And the smaller one, I used the 5-inch, and I had a little 3-inch pot for the 2-pot setup. I need to compare apples to apples on this. That will have to be my next test, but I'm about to move. So, I'm not a statistician. I don't know if this is the best way to share this information, so I really hope that what I have shown in what happened in my tests is the best way. If you'd like to look at my information, I have put it all on my Patreon page. I still have more tests to perform. I really want to try different fuels, but I needed to get this information together and get it out. But with this, I now have another question to answer. How much of a difference does it make to have a larger pot? And is there a limit to that? Is there diminishing returns? Ooh, that's bad. I don't need to think any harder. Next step. I wish I had more sensors. I wish I had some high temp sensors so I could put them inside, but I'll just have to see what I can do once I can set up my test rig again. I still want to try the different fuels again. I still want to try different numbers of candles. I know that I can put 7 or 8 candles in the tray that I've used, because I did that on my very, very first test that exploded and made me start wanting to do the rest of these videos. There are so many different variables to try. I'm going to be testing for decades. Anyhow, thank you for watching. Please check out my Patreon page. I'm going to put all of my raw data on there so that anyone who wants to can view it. Thank you for your time. I will see you in the next video.